Good morning, everyone. My name is Peter Vermeersch, and I'm a professor of political studies at the University of Leuven, and it's my great honor to welcome you here to this event of the KU Leuven's Forum on Central and Eastern Europe. And this morning also marks the opening event of a two-day workshop we are organizing here with a diverse group of distinguished experts on the topic of memory politics in the former Yugoslavia. We have cultural sociologists and historians and political scientists and cultural studies academics and film scholars, and a lot of them join us from the region. Now, our focus this morning is also on memory and remembrance in that important part of Europe, southeastern Europe. And in particular, we're going to talk about how the memories of conflict and war, and by extension also the memories of peace, I suppose, how these are preserved and perceived in the Balkans. And we will explore this theme through two very different perspectives. The architectural lens, talking about monuments and memorials, but also the experiential lens of everyday life. So let me introduce the two guests we have for this conversation on these topics. Sabina Tanović is an architect and researcher specializing in memorial projects that address traumatic pasts. She graduated from the Faculty of Architecture at the University of Sarajevo and holds also degrees from Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands, where she also teaches. And her current research explores the construction of contemporary memorials informed by participatory approaches. She wrote a book recently, 2019. Designing Memory is the title, a subtitle, The Architecture of Commemoration in Europe from 1914 to the Present with Cambridge University Press. And in that book she analyzes the evolution of memorial architecture since the First World War. Our second guest is Ilir Gashi, who is a journalist, an activist, and media development expert from Belgrade in Serbia. He began his journalism career as a reviewer of computer games, and later he shifted focus to initiate a human rights and legal literacy program in Serbia. He also led an organization dedicated to media freedom, the sustainability of local media, and the safety of journalists in Serbia. And most recently, he works with independent media journalists, activists, and citizens around the topic of storytelling, and also with community-based NGOs across the Balkans to help them tell their stories more effectively. And he's a storyteller, as you will hear, but also, and we will talk about that, I hope too, a hitchhiker. So he travels through the region and the world to capture and convey the reality of the world in which we all live. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
So I'd like to open with the following question. So post-war memories is an important topic in the work that you both do, but in a very different way, it seems. You know, for Sabina, it's about design and placement of monuments and memorials, and for you, Ilir, it involves more the fleeting nature of everyday memories of people that you meet along the road. But you both engage with the topic of memories and with citizens, grassroots perspectives, visitors in the case of monuments, or people, you know, traveling along with you in the case of your journalism work. So my first question is very open. What intrigues you about the interaction between memories in the Balkans on the one hand, and specifically post-war and post-conflict memories, and, you know, the relation that people have towards those memories and towards those objects of memories that they cherish or they ignore? Or so what is it that intrigues you about that relationship between people and post-war memories? Could you say something broad about that? Perhaps Sabina, you want to start?
Yeah, first, thank you for having me. Maybe it's interesting to first give some context, my personal context, why this fascination with memorial spaces, memorial architecture and design, where does it come from? So I lived through the siege of Sarajevo in the 90s, and I then, as a young child, teenager almost, during those 4 years, I, on a bodily level, experienced how important spaces architecture is for survival, for mechanisms of survival, but also for mechanisms of destruction. And then somehow, intuitively, after the siege, after the war, I continued being interested in space and how we create space, and particularly memorial space. So how do we preserve these traumatic memories? So actually, it was very simple, modest, personal fascination, how to preserve this experience of these 4 years in space, really. And this is why I studied architecture. This was really the singular reason, and I graduated also there with a memorial project. But that project only showed me how limited the design or architectural knowledge really is on creating memorial spaces. So this was the incentive that propelled me into continuing my research. Basically, my whole career is built around how we design memorial spaces. Why are they important? Do we need them? And what do they mean? How they stay visible. So in the context of Bosnia and Herzegovina, concretely Sarajevo, I'm still deeply involved, even though my research particularly dealt with the evolution of memorial architecture as a genre in Europe, in West, let's say. I purposefully made this distance from my own context to try to grasp a bit more the knowledge of memorial architecture, let's say. But in the last couple of years, I'm more organically going back to the context of Sarajevo and Bosnia and Herzegovina, in a way trying to bridge this experience and knowledge about creating space for remembrance and how this is done in Sarajevo concretely. And I'm really looking into the processes of doing this. So this is where I come from.
Yeah, thank you. So what is your story behind your interest in post-war memories and how they come to life in the conversations that you have with the people that you interview or meet along the way?
Mm-hmm. Also thank you for having me. It's really a great privilege to be here, especially in a venue like this. It makes me feel like an aristocrat, which I always kind of strive for. So I don't think I really had like an organic interest in post-war memories as such. It's just that they emerge everywhere all the time. And what I find intriguing about it is the relationship between individual memories and collective memory. And most of the time, if there is a conflict between an individual memory and the collective one, it's the individual one that will suffer, and people will tend to push away their individual memory because there is no mainstream narrative to support this memory and to make a place to fit this memory inside. But the closer you get to people, these, say, alternative memories come to the fore as well. So what I'm saying is that it's very difficult to have a memory that in any way opposes the overarching narrative. So in very much the same sense, I think people will initially only recollect memories that support whatever the governing narrative is. You always need to have this narrative for you to also talk about this memory. The closer you get with this person, other memories will also emerge.
Yeah. Sabina, is this something you recognize from your work, that might be a discrepancy and a tension between people's personal memories and the way that conflict is commemorated and remembered collectively in the public space, and the politics that surrounds that collective memory? Do you recognize that tension also in the context of designing monuments?
Yes, certainly. This is inherent, I think, in the process itself. It's actually quite traditional way of making official monuments, memorials, museums. The official narrative versus the individual memory and recollections. So the framework is essential. In the context of Sarajevo, we see the memory boom in the last 5 years, I would say, where literally every municipality in Sarajevo has a number of realized projects in the making, future projects. They're becoming bigger, more prominent, more present in the public space, in a way ossifying the official narrative, while there is a performative, I would say, kind of a level of giving space for individual recollections, but really only within the official framework. So there is no real essential or true kind of a approach toward the individual remembrance outside this official, ossifying official framework, you know. So this is what I see happening more and more, and manifested in public space. Really.
Is there an attempt in Sarajevo of some of these projects maybe to indeed involve citizens in some meaningful way, or
in the performative way? Yes, I would say there are even some kind of smaller examples of actually really meaningful way. But then they, at least to my knowledge, and what I see is that they then still, after a year or two in being meaningful, they sideways toward the performative kind of a quality, you know, like they would maybe start as a collective invitation to all citizens to send a couple of sentences of what, for example, siege meant for them. And this is, the reactions of citizens is normally really impressive, because you can see that people need this space to speak. But then that becomes kind of a fixed archive, then you know, models into a museum, private museum, or some kind of remembrance project, and then it goes outside of the context of, you know, being collective, or a kind of memory business operation that really then, you know, has suddenly very nicely defined important values on paper, but becomes suddenly very ambitious in a sense of outreach, and, you know, instead of being focused on the community, the local community, let's say. This is what I see really missing in a lot of projects.
So you mentioned memory boom over the last 5 years, and I'm wondering, Ilir, is it also your impression from, you know, the viewpoint, I suppose, from Belgrade, that there is this recent hyperproduction of official memorialization going on? Has it increased recently? It's always been there, obviously, but has it increased recently? And if so, do you think there is a reason why this is happening now?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, there is always a reason in this regard, because, I mean, obviously these narratives support our identities, and usually it's the political power that wants to create a certain narrative. It pushes forward parts of history, that some of which might not even have happened, to create this narrative. And we can also challenge the very idea of collective memory, whether such thing exists as such, or it is just a recreation of history to support the governing narrative, because there is no real space for a critical debate, for critical assessment, for looking at facts, for determining what actually happened. So it's only being used or misused to support a certain narrative for certain political reasons. Some of you, especially those coming from the region, might know about the mass grave that was found of Kosovar Albanians that were like 15 kilometers outside Belgrade on this police special unit training ground, which happened, I think, in 2001 or 2002. And I have a feeling that it was more people knew about this 20 years ago than today. So there is also a way of collective forgetting. In this regard, collective memory and collective forgetting are both instruments of creating a narrative. And in this picture, an individual memory doesn't really play an important role. It plays a role only to the extent to which it supports the narrative. Otherwise, it's an incident and it needs to be taken out of the picture. So what I'm really interested in is finding these memories that go against the flow. I think there is also a way of talking to someone that can create this atmosphere for these memories to emerge, and it creates a crack in the wall. And these cracks are, I think, the most interesting ones.
Yeah. So maybe the politics of remembering, the hyperproduction of memorials and all that, is maybe politics of forgetting, or trying to mold people's memories in a certain way that they forget certain important things. Is that what you're trying to say as well, Sabina?
To add to this, I definitely agree. You said something which I was also thinking lately, is that I see, like 2006, perhaps 2005, there was more meaningful reflection, and also design-wise, there were more meaningful proposals how to remember, what to rethink, reconstruct the whole notion of a public monument than there are now. For example, the Sarajevo Center for Contemporary Art organized in, I think it was 2006, a project to deconstruct the monument. And there was a project within that project called New Monument, and they invited artists and citizens to give proposals for, what would be a new monument. And if you can look it up on the internet, it's still there. There are very interesting proposals that were set forth. So this is 2006, and we are now almost 20 years since, right? And if you are now in Sarajevo, you will see a lot of copy-paste remembrance spaces, which also needed, to be sure, because there is incredible trauma, still collective trauma in Sarajevo that was never really addressed. So people do need this space, but it's given primarily through these white stone, I will call them monuments with names, which after some time also become invisible, especially to new generations, So this is what I mean by ossifying. This also means forgetting, really, because
and becoming invisible.
Yes.
Exactly. Yes, you mentioned in your book this famous quote by Robert Musil that monuments are the most invisible. I'm just paraphrasing, most invisible objects in our urban environment. Monuments are there supposedly to remember, but the way they are constructed and the way they are ossified, they do contribute to forgetting and to invisibility of the real trauma that is in society.
Certainly so. And if you talk also about art, I would expect from artists, contemporary artists, to also be critically engaged with remembrance and re-examine what's happening. For instance, this memory boom I'm mentioning. But if you look, I will give one example. Like maybe most of you know, like Bosnian Girl art piece from who is it? Šela Kamerić. This is a very relevant historical artwork, also from 2006, so same year, thinking now. But this is what it is. It's a historical work. That's how I see it. But it's still promoted as very actual contemporary artwork that, in my view, is more actually an obstacle at this point in time. It should be recontextualized. In these 2 decades have passed. And artist herself also, again, to my knowledge, is still promoting it as a very actual contemporary work. I mean, of course it is, but it needs to be recontextualized. Yeah.
Do you have any examples of contemporary artists currently anywhere in the Balkans, maybe in Bosnia, who are doing things with this remembrance boom that is now present, that they try to interrupt it or make the trauma visible again?
There are certainly, but they are mostly avant-garde or not really prominent or known about. I would say they're still in pockets of public conscience in society. Recently, I've been, and I'm still busy with, for example, the Vraca Memorial site in Sarajevo. So this is from the Yugoslav period park, and Serbian forces were then also occupying this park. They were, targeting citizens from this spot. So it's this ambiguous place, for instance, and basically a memorial that belongs to nobody, but still belongs to everybody. And both Republic of Srpska and Federation, everyone claims it for their own purposes. But there are some actions and young artists who try to kind of propose new ways of approaching these spaces, for instance, and spaces of potential for maybe agonistic space of remembrance, maybe for new monuments, So there are initiatives like this, but also architects who are much more straightforward thinking in terms they want to build something beautiful. They're also busy with, thinking how and what. But rarely I see that artists and designers are focused on processes.
They should be.
They should be. I think we all should be focused on processes, because this leads to the physical manifestation of something. Yep. And processes, I would say, more important often than the final work.
Yeah, this leads me to your work, Ilir, because I think that storytelling and ideal high quality journalism is an intervention in a way in this process, isn't it? I mean, it's bringing the invisible or making the invisible visible through encounters and retelling the stories that are living among the population. I wonder if you could say a little bit about that in the context of a well-known and awarded story that you've written about the alternative Balkan postal system. And perhaps you can explain a little bit what the story is about, and how memories, post-war memories specifically, then are present in that story. It's a beautiful story. I recommend everyone to read it if you haven't. It's a piece of journalism, but also reads like a short story by Chekhov. So it's really marvelous.
It's actually much longer than most of his stories.
Oh well.
But coincidentally, I have it in my pocket here, so if you don't mind. So the story it's really simple in the sense that it pictures something that almost everyone in the Balkans and in other places around the world knows about and often does or do. That's sending stuff by buses to other places. One of the reasons is, of course, the practical one. It's usually cheaper. It's almost always faster than any postal service. But how I came to the idea of writing a story was while I was traveling between Belgrade and Pristina, and I was traveling a lot at the time, I still do, I realized every single time someone would ask me to bring something for someone. So after a few trips, I was already in possession, although a temporary one, of a series of bizarre physical objects that people would give me to give to someone else. And I thought there must be a story behind these objects. And what I discovered then was that even better, it's not as much about the objects, it's about the people. And it's about the emotions that are actually kind of embedded into these objects that are being sent. So you send things to someone, usually because you care about this person to the extent that you want to send something to this person. She needs something or wants or whatever. So it's also about, and yes, the most important fact is that between Serbia and Kosovo, it's literally impossible to use formal postal system because there is none. They don't recognize each other. So technically, it's impossible to send anything between Serbia and Kosovo. So this is why these bus routes become so important. And then once you dive into these relationships between people sending stuff to each other, you realize that they are the ones going against the stream. They are kind of keeping the networks, keeping the relationships alive, not letting the other one feel forgotten. And this is when you become aware of this huge alternative network of relationships, of stories, of experiences, of, when you look at the two societies, they seem to be divided by a huge, fat brick wall, as if there was no communication between them. But once you get into it, you realize there are so many cracks in it. And all of them are being unrecognized most of the time because they are not needed to support the current narrative. They're actually unneeded.
But yes, but people send food, they send cigarettes, they send powder from which they make
toy
soup.
dolls,
so
yes, all kinds of things.
Could you say that these are like mini memorials in a way? Because it's not about exactly what they are, but what they represent.
I'm not sure if I would use the word memorial.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe if I thought about it a little bit, maybe later I can get back with you and we can discuss this further. But
they're symbols of something.
They are symbols of these relationships, I think, and they are still there. What makes me really sad is that most of these connections were made in the time before the wars, and it is almost exclusively a matter of this older generation of people that had an opportunity to meet each other, and now some of these relationships are still existing, but they're fading. And new generations are not meeting as much or at all. And as we know, as people who live in Serbia or Kosovo might know, that there is this Mirdita Dobar Dan festival. It's the only one of the very few points of contact between Serbian and Kosovar cultural scenes. It has been going on for 10 years, this festival, but this year it will be cancelled, most probably, in Belgrade because of the lack of political will, or should I say the presence of political will to create conflict. Mm-hmm. So even this one small spot of exchange will now vanish. So in 10 years' time, or 20 years' time, there will be no more people sending stuff by buses anymore. those people will be dead, and there will be no new people to replace them. So that's the sad part.
Yeah. Sabina, if we talk about these objects and symbols, and you know, we can sort of tentatively perhaps call them little fleeting monuments representing some sort of memory. How do you look at these objects from the perspective of an architect? Are these objects, in your view, some sort of spontaneous monuments, or how do you perceive this story?
Yeah, sure. Anything can be a monument and a memorial, depending on the value you give it, right? Sarajevo is loaded with artifacts and monuments, and you know, it's more and more you can find in like mushrooming private museums in the city, because we don't have a law about musealization, so everybody can basically do what they want, right? Yep. I find this horrendous. Because suddenly you walk in a private museum that says, this is how we lived in the siege, and then I'm like, no, I didn't, you know, but there are all these artifacts, somebody's, and I would find it more genuine if a family, if they really want to express themselves like that, I would say, okay, no problem, but then say, this is our experience, you know, also like putting us all in this collective bin of this is how we lived is really dangerous. I think reducing things, remembrance to symbols is a very dangerous thing to do. At the same time, it's necessary. So it's about, I guess, balance here. So one example I can give from practice is, so it was 2016. I won a competition for one. First award was not given. It's a thing, let's say, you know. So I got the second award, like the best solution to be implemented for a tunnel in Sarajevo. I don't know if you know about it. It was dug under the airport, and many call it Lifeline. So that was 2016, right? So they wanted to build it, and basically we're talking about two huge buildings on both sides of the airport runway, right? I proposed them from rammed earth, and I proposed actually citizens to make it, because it's a very old-fashioned way of building houses in the Balkans and actually in whole Europe, if you look, you know, through with rammed earth. So I wanted to go back to this, you know, hands-on approach to memory. Of course, it's still not happening. But I'm still in conversation with the people who are responsible. They're called now Memorial Fund. I think they changed just recently their name. They're responsible for war cemeteries, and you know they take care of some of the memorials, and also for the tunnel. So I keep this conversation alive, and I'm still focused on soil, on earth, because this is what was needed to dug the tunnel, right? The huge amounts of earth were extracted. So now, in that conversation over the last couple of years, so since 2016, when I saw that, this project is not going to happen anytime soon, maybe if there's political will, I still want to engage citizens in the whole story, in the narrative of this place as a collective place of remembrance. So we are now doing workshops with the local soil there on site. So literally inviting citizens to like make the Dorodango bowls, you call them, spheres, just to kind of sit around, make these spheres and talk. And we record the oral history, we record the narratives, and then the idea is to exhibit these spheres, you know, in a future museum space or the space that is there already on the site. So this is a very small little thing to do, very simple, straightforward, but I think as a symbol of, you know, of the place, so the materiality of that very place, without building huge museums and memorials, it's more important to really talk, but still be engaged with let's say, soil as a symbol. So, you know, the direct link. And
again, the process there is very important, but you also preserve it, because otherwise, like Ilir, like you said, things disappear, and practices might disappear as well. So things that are important are getting forgotten in the meantime. Yeah.
And it's definitely a way also to engage with younger generations, I would say, you know, because through this narration and being engaged with soil in this case, or whatever else is in a context you're talking, you are looking at, is also a way to connect. Quite literally connect, you know, or make that platform where people can start at least thinking.
Exactly, yeah. And so connection in the Balkan postal system is also a very important thing. What is also important in your story, I think, is that there's a distrust of the official postal service. And maybe this is also a metaphor for something bigger, that indeed the reliance on these personal memories and these personal objects shows that there is a distrust in general towards the institutions that want to promote an official memory story. But at the same time, you could perhaps say, I'm wondering whether it is the politicians and governing elites that are actually using memories, producing memory politics, producing these memory stories in order to gain somehow the trust of the population in some weird, or they hope to regain the trust of the population. Do you think there's something of that going on?
Maybe they're, in my view at least, unfortunately, they most of the time have this trust there, because if you control the entire media system, the way you do in Serbia, for instance, and to a lesser extent in other countries of the region, it's very difficult to find independent media as such. And when you control education system, in the sense that you control the history textbooks, also geography and language, and you are in position to control the reality in some way, because you control the history. I mean, everyone knows that from 1984. I often think about the early 90s or late 80s. I was a kid at the time. I was born in Yugoslavia, and I grew up in a Yugoslav family setting. And then at one point, I could see it in the environment, how this entire Yugoslav thing was being erased and how these nationalist narratives started pushing in. And I swear to you, people would go to bed at night being Yugoslavs, and they would wake up being Serbs, for instance. Or, of course, it was a longer process. In Serbia, in particular, it started in the early 80s. It started in Kosovo in some ways. So it was a slow process, but there was, I think, a break point where you were expected and only socially acceptable if you would define yourself through the nationalist lens. And I always think how much power it would take for each person individually to break these memories inside. Memories of the beautiful times they had during Yugoslavia, holidays in Croatia, all that, the friends they made, teenage love affairs they had, all of that, they had to push it aside and to say everything was wrong. This was all a fantasy, a nightmare, and now it is the Serbs what we are, or it could be any other ethnicity. It takes so much power to do this, and I think it's so painful. So if we could talk about the pain of conflict, I think it's also the sum of all these individual pains in breaking the memories and in accepting that you were emotionally wrong because you believed in this previous identity and you were wrong about it. So it's this new one. So yeah.
So maybe that's not a relationship of trust, but of power and manipulation, as you describe it, right? So.
Yeah. This worries me a lot. Again, in the context of official remembrance and memory politics. If you look, for example, the Srebrenica Memorial Museum in the very context of now and what is happening in Palestine and destruction of Palestine, let's say, I don't know if you followed up, but the management director of Srebrenica Memorial Center explicitly said he doesn't want to be equated with Hamas, and they really took a political stance. And to my knowledge and what I see actually in the public relations is that they really, he specifically, and treats it as if it's his living room, the memorial museum. I mean, and also, this really is, the power play, because I personally also work with a lot of survivors. There's the initiative to create a national memorial in the Netherlands right now. So I'm working with a group who initiated this. Groups, actually. It's also Dutch Bet is involved. And a lot of survivors are outraged because Memorial Center, as an official institution of respect and very, very important institution, deserves better, must do better, right, than politicize remembrance or allow it to be politicized like this. And this is also a very dangerous in context also a lot of Holocaust, if not all Holocaust memorial museums. We will need a lot of re-examining and rethinking.
Let's open the lens a little bit. You mentioned the Second World War, Holocaust, and so if we compare the processes of politicization on the one hand of memory in the Balkans and on the other hand the resistance that exists to it, or the personal, small kind of stories that disrupt these dominant narratives. Is this a phenomenon you see outside of the former Yugoslavia as well? And Sabina, I know you've worked a lot about memorials elsewhere in Europe regarding the First and the Second World War. So do you see some of these same processes happening in other places as well? Is it comparable, or is it something different in the former Yugoslavia?
Certainly, it's not exclusive for former Yugoslavia. I'm always for comparison. Of course, we have to acknowledge the specificities of certain context. You know, everything is at the same time very different, but we need to compare for the sake of science and scholarship. I mean, how else? And I think this is also very necessary right now to do so, because I mean, I also am currently a victim of a lot of censorship, and my events were cancelled just trying to speak truth to power, let's say, at my own university, you know. And
can you make that specific?
Yeah, with some colleagues, we tried to organize an event in April, I think. We were working on it for 3 months. It was called Architecturing Destruction in Palestine, concretely, because it's something what we always do when there is a conflict, when there is, you know, something globally important happening, like it was also with Ukraine. We invite scholars from that context to tell us about their insights. And so this is what we wanted to do now, and it proved impossible. Our event was cancelled literally 2 days before it was supposed to take place. The reasons given to us was that they cannot guarantee our safety. But the public statement by the dean was something completely different. He opened up space where we potentially are also a party that is not providing, could endanger a constructive dialogue, let's say. So this kind of politicization and weaponization of safety in this context is very, very dangerous.
So when we broaden the scope of that question to you as well, so when you travel through Europe and you have these conversations with people while you're, for example, hitchhiking across the continent, do you recognize some of these stories and encounters that you have outside Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, with the stories you have back in the Balkans?
To some extent, yes. Of course, every society has its own narratives and taboos that are not being dug into. On the other side, I do know the region much better than I know other places, and I'm aware of the nuances that are invisible to me when I go to these other places. But there is always something in those encounters that at some point becomes challenging to the narrative in some way.
Yeah. And is that a hopeful story, you think? Is that a hopeful story, a hopeful phenomenon? Yeah.
Would I say it's hopeful? I'm not sure. For me, it's the only one that makes sense in the way to open up these spaces in which you can challenge these narratives. You find stories. You don't find them. You don't look for them. They come to you because they are everywhere. That's also, I think, a very important point. You don't need to look hard at all. I think almost everyone, not almost everyone, has a story that's conflicting the governing narrative, because our experience as such cannot conform to this very oversimplified, exclusive way of looking at reality. So everyone carries experiences that are different. It's just a question whether we will be able to create the space in which people will feel encouraged to step forward with these stories, in which they will feel safe about sharing those. I always remember this guy. It's not a travel story. It's this guy from Belgrade, a war veteran from Bosnia and Croatia and Kosovo, that I met by coincidence. He's an owner of a bar, of a very dodgy bar, and it's like a proper extreme right-wing setting, extreme nationalist, anti-Semitic, anti-everything. And somehow I ended up spending time with this guy, and it took us so much time for him to start opening up about his war experience. I come from two sides, kind of, from Serbian-Albanian with Serbian-Albanian origin. So it's kind of a puzzle to most people who meet me, because I live in Belgrade, I don't speak Albanian, I have the most Albanian name in the world. So they get confused which is a good starting point. It's the best starting point. I think confusion is what really makes you open to things. And it wasn't until I wrote this story about a small Serbian community living in this western part of Kosovo, very isolated community, that made him feel trust towards me, because it was, I think, in his eyes, a sort of legitimization of myself. And then I have to tell you this, it's bragging, I'm bragging about it, and I'm so happy, because he actually made another guy who was an actor to read it out loud. Like it's a 25,000 character piece to an entire kafana, and that's like my life success. It's a really long piece. But then he told me a story. It was the first time when he shared a story like this, when he first came to Kosovo as a Serbian soldier, how he participated in a robbery. They robbed an Albanian merchant. He wanted to buy cigarettes, but then the policeman said, "Hey, we don't buy cigarettes around here, we just take them." And he felt shame from being part of this situation 25 years ago. And in 25 years, I don't think he had many people around him he could share this story with, even though he felt this shame throughout this period. And then on that night, after having a few drinks, he did share it. And I think it is, for me personally, going back to your question that you posed some 12 minutes ago, about hope. I don't know about hope, because hope is about whether presence can produce something positive in the future. I don't know about that, but being in the presence, it's the only thing that makes sense for me, to create these spaces where things happen that interfere with whatever is the governing narrative.
Yeah.
And this is where, like, this edgy space, it's very shaky, but it's exciting, and it's where you get the most out of anything.
Yeah, I see Sabina nodding, but the word space, I think, means something to you.
Architects only talk about space, always.
Yes. Yeah. You architects.
Yeah, metaphorical, literal space. No, but while you were talking, I had a reference to, again, something spatial. Yeah, the Sarajevo Red Line. It was 2012. It was very visually impressive, the line of red chairs.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
That were installed in the Ferhadija, the main street of Sarajevo. So it was really impressive to see, very sad at the same time. Because
commemorating missing people, or people
murdered during the siege. So each chair was dedicated to one person. And it still looks beautiful on images. But there was a lot of controversy about the project itself. So I think there is also potential in this controversy. So what happened, they installed it for one day. It was performative. There was a theater play, so there was an empty audience, chair without audience, basically, looking at this performance. But the citizens were not really allowed to, just wander around the chairs, some, but it was really controlled environment. And they were also not invited beforehand to contribute, let's say. And the chairs were both in Serbia. So, on them it said like made in Serbia. So this was one of the controversies. There was a lot of discussion about it. So okay, it happened. A lot of people also welcomed it because, again, their identity, their suffering, what happened was recognized in the public eye, and it traveled around the world and it's still there. If you look it up, it's still used as a reference. But I'm thinking again about the process and rethinking what you're doing. How much more power this temporary project would have elicited if citizens would have been invited to meaningfully participate, to talk, to bring their own chairs, or there are so many creative ways to do this, to create the space you're talking about, and I think it's really a shame that we are not doing that, but just building new projects. New monuments and stuff. Yeah. So I'm just kind of repeating what I said before, but through another example to add to what you were saying.
It's a missed opportunity of preserving something that will be meaningful and at the same time not letting it ossify, to use your
exactly. But why not say, okay, we made a mistake, let's bring it again and let's just make it better. Yeah. That's also a way to go about it.
Is it not also in both of these perspectives on the matter a question of having the right forum for people to come together together, and the right platform, I suppose. And one would think in current times that in the digital field, there will be some opportunities there. But I wonder, because there it seems that the process you described, Ilir, earlier on in the conversation, that people are forced to adopt a particular narrative, that in the digital sphere this is very much present, that people are divided into camps. I don't know, is the digital sphere a forum or a platform where these personal memories can be preserved, or do we need to look at more of these concrete, specific spaces in the real world?
I think it starts, it's less the question of whether it's digital or non-digital. Of course, there are things that only exist in digital sphere. The way it works is different from the outside of digital. That's a fact. But I think the real problem is that, to me, it seems like there is no real intention to create these forums, because they come with risks. You know, if you invite people to freely share, to really freely share what they remember and how, it becomes a risk, because it creates these cracks, and things are nicer with no cracks. You know, they're easier to deal with. So I think the knowledge of these risks that are involved makes most people feel uncomfortable, and they like to avoid that and to keep it simple and structured, even though it's not entirely true, and even though it's not at all inclusive. Inclusiveness takes effort, you know, it takes strength and decisiveness and courage to create. And if one thing, it's because you cannot control the outcome of it. So once we get to this stage, once we start creating out of habit these spaces that are completely free for remembering and talking about things that happened, then we can look at the distinction between the digital and non-digital. Of course, social media with polarization, algorithms and everything, it adds a lot of weight to this, but I think the problem lies elsewhere.
Yeah, the intention. Sabina, you recognize this? This is also for thinking about, from the perspective of architecture, to the issue of commemoration.
We're also living in an archive boom, I would say. There are a lot of archives that are growing and developing, and in different contexts, different oral history, you know, narratives are being collected at the moment, but they are always framed in a specific, for specific groups, specific topic, but indeed there are too less, if any, meaningful that are curating towards this inclusive kind of a space. So this is what we need to work on, I think, but this gives also hope for the future, because there are some incentives, like, you know, like artistic or design-wise, or ideas at least in conceptualization, but I think this will happen. It needs to happen at least.
Very good. I think on this note that it needs to happen and that there is some hope, I think that's a good note to end this conversation. Sabina Tanović and Ilir Gashi, thank you so much for this wonderful input. Thank you.
Thank you.